As I stepped into the lavishly decorated banquet hall, my eyes immediately found her. Zelda stood across the room, laughing softly, her emerald dress shimmering under the chandelier's glow. But my breath caught when I saw the man beside her, Cody. His arm rested too comfortably on her waist, his smirk dripping with arrogance. He noticed me and sauntered over, his voice dripping with mockery. "So, you're the husband. Surprising to see you here, brave even." The room seemed to blur as fury bubbled inside me, my fists clenched at my sides, my heart pounding like a war drum. Cody's smirk widened as he leaned in closer. "She deserves better, you know, someone who knows how to make her feel alive." Before I could stop myself, my fist connected with his jaw. The room fell silent, gasps echoing around us as Cody staggered back, clutching his face. Zelda's horrified gasp rang in my ears, but I didn't care. The facade was shattered, the lies, the deceit, it all came crashing down. But before we dive deeper into this shocking story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another gripping story. The warm glow of the dining room chandelier cast a golden light over the table, illuminating a scene that could have been lifted from a family photo album. Michael sat at the head of the table, a proud smile on his face as he watched his daughters banter. Ellie, just 14 but already brimming with wit, teased her older sister Sarah, who rolled her eyes in mock exasperation. "Sarah," Michael began, pointing his fork at the plate in front of him, "when did you become such a good chef? Did you sneak a peek at my secret recipe book?" Sarah smirked as she twirled spaghetti around her fork. "Dad, it's spaghetti, not exactly culinary rocket science." Ellie burst into laughter, nearly spilling her glass of milk. "Yeah, Dad, next you're going to claim credit for boiling water." Michael feigned offense, clutching his chest. "You wound me, Ellie. Do you know how long it took me to perfect the art of seasoning the water?" The girls giggled, their laughter a harmonious melody that filled the room. Michael cherished these moments, the easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the sense of family. Yet, even in this idyllic scene, a faint shadow loomed. Across the table, Zelda sat with her phone beside her plate, her fork idly pushing food around. She offered a polite smile now and then, but her gaze frequently drifted to the glowing screen. A soft buzz broke the rhythm of the evening. Zelda's hand darted out, flipping the phone over as her lips curled into a smile, a private, fleeting expression Michael hadn't seen in years. "Mom," Ellie piped up, breaking the spell, "are you coming to my game this weekend?" Zelda looked up, her smile fading. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, though her tone lacked conviction. Her forced smile lingered a moment too long before she turned back to her plate. Michael noticed. He always noticed. But tonight, as he reached for his glass of wine, he chose to ignore the tightening in his chest. It was nothing, he told himself. Just work stress, like always. "Great," Ellie said brightly, seemingly unaware of the tension. "I need you to cheer extra loud this time. We're playing Riverview and their goalie is insane." "I'll be there," Zelda promised, her voice soft. Michael wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the smile she gave Ellie was genuine. But the faint trace of unfamiliar cologne that lingered when she walked past him earlier whispered otherwise. As the conversation shifted back to lighthearted teasing, Michael's eyes lingered on Zelda. She had always been beautiful, poised, and magnetic, but lately there was a distance, a subtle, growing chasm he couldn't bridge. The phone buzzed again, a low hum that barely disturbed the air. But this time, Zelda ignored it. She caught Michael's gaze and gave him a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. The evening ended as it always did, with hugs and kisses, the girls retreating to their rooms, and Zelda murmuring something about a late email she had to answer. Alone in the quiet of the living room, Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the remnants of dinner. The laughter had faded, but the scent of cologne lingered. The house settled into its familiar evening quiet, but Michael's mind refused to follow. As he sat on the edge of their bed, watching Zelda at her vanity, he couldn't help but reflect on their life together. They had built something good, something worth cherishing. Their daughters were thriving, their home was warm and filled with laughter. He had always considered himself lucky, blessed, even, to share it all with Zelda. But lately, cracks had begun to appear. Subtle ones, almost invisible, but there nonetheless. Zelda seemed distant, her laughter less frequent, her touch more reserved. Michael shook his head, as though trying to clear the uneasy thoughts that lingered. Love was about trust, wasn't it? He couldn't let small things erode that foundation. The scent of unfamiliar cologne lingered in his mind, though. Earlier that evening, when Zelda had leaned over to kiss him goodnight, it had been there. Sharp and foreign. He dismissed it as paranoia, some errant scent from a colleague or a passing stranger. Still, it gnawed at him in the quiet. The following days brought no clarity, only more questions. Zelda's behavior shifted in ways Michael couldn't ignore. She began attending frequent work dinners, always with an explanation that felt too polished, too rehearsed. Her wardrobe, once understated and practical, now leaned toward sleek dresses and heels, accompanied by bold lipstick she hadn't worn in years. It wasn't the woman he had known. One evening, Zelda walked into the living room, dressed impeccably in a deep emerald dress that clung to her frame. Michael looked up from his book, raising an eyebrow with a teasing grin. "Wow, you're all dressed up tonight. Who's the lucky client?" Her response was immediate, cold and sharp. "It's just work, Michael. Don't start." The words stung more than he cared to admit. Michael forced a smile, but inside a storm churned. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to his own insecurities, but the evidence continued to pile up. A gold necklace, delicate and unfamiliar, had appeared around her neck a week ago. When he asked about it, she'd waved him off, saying it was a team gift from her colleagues. The story didn't sit right. Michael found himself cataloging these moments, unable to stop. The late nights, the new perfume, the clipped tone whenever he asked simple questions. Each detail etched itself into his mind like tally marks, and together, they painted a picture he didn't want to see. The days rolled by with an unsettling rhythm, each one bringing more unanswered questions. One evening, as Michael sat at the dinner table flipping through the mail, Zelda casually mentioned an upcoming workplace Christmas party. Her tone was light, almost too light, as if she were trying to deflect attention before he could ask. "It's just for employees," she said, glancing briefly in his direction before focusing on her plate. "You know how these corporate things are." Michael nodded, his expression neutral, though his chest tightened. "Sounds like a big deal," he said, careful to keep his tone even. "What's the theme this year?" "Oh, nothing fancy," she replied, brushing off the question. "Just the usual." Her words settled awkwardly between them, and Michael felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping in again. He wanted to trust her, to believe it was nothing more than another office obligation, but the distance in her voice was unmistakable. A few days later, Michael was out front, chatting with their neighbor Greg, a friendly but nosy man who always seemed to have his finger on the pulse of the neighborhood. "You know," Greg began, leaning casually against the fence, "I ran into your wife at that new cafe downtown last week." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" "Yeah," Greg continued, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "She was with that guy from work. They looked like a fun pair, laughing and all that." Michael's smile froze. He forced a chuckle, trying to mask the sudden rush of unease. "Yeah, she's great with her team," he said lightly, his grip tightening on the rake he was holding. Greg nodded, oblivious to the tension now simmering beneath Michael's calm facade. "Well, you've got a good one, Mike. She's always so put together." Michael muttered something in agreement, but the words barely registered. His mind raced, replaying Greg's comment over and over. A fun pair. The phrase felt like a splinter lodged in his chest, impossible to ignore. That night, as Zelda prepared for bed, Michael watched her from his side of the room. She seemed at ease, humming softly as she moisturized her hands. He wanted to confront her, to ask directly about the cafe, about the man Greg had mentioned, but instead he stayed silent, unsure of what he wanted to hear. "Everything okay?" Zelda asked, catching his gaze in the mirror. Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yeah, just tired." She offered a small smile and turned off the light, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but he wasn't ready to see it yet. Michael parked a block away from the venue, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. The warm glow of string lights spilled out from the windows of the banquet hall, casting shadows on the frosted sidewalk. The muffled sound of laughter and holiday music drifted into the still night. For a moment, he sat there, debating whether to go in at all. But the memory of Greg's comment, the late nights, and the lies propelled him forward. The cold air bit at his face as he stepped out of the car. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier, as though his body already knew what his mind was trying to deny. Inside, the party was in full swing. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, its branches weighed down by glittering ornaments. Laughter bubbled up from small clusters of people holding champagne flutes, their faces flushed with holiday cheer. Michael scanned the room, his pulse quickening. And then he saw her. Zelda stood near the bar, her emerald dress shimmering under the soft lights. Her head was tilted back in laughter, a laugh Michael hadn't heard in months. Next to her stood a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a self-assured smirk that made Michael's stomach churn. The man leaned in closer than necessary, his hand resting lightly on Zelda's lower back. Michael's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides as he made his way through the crowd, each step bringing him closer to the truth he'd been avoiding. The festive music seemed to fade, replaced by the deafening rush of blood in his ears. Cody noticed him first. The younger man turned, his smirk widening into something cruel and mocking. "Well, well," he drawled, raising his glass, "so you're the husband." Zelda's face went pale as she turned to face Michael. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low but frantic. Michael ignored her, his gaze locked on Cody. "And you are?" Cody chuckled, taking a casual sip of his drink. "Cody, I work with Zelda. You know, long hours, late nights." He trailed off, letting the insinuation hang in the air. Michael's fists clenched tighter. His chest felt like it was going to explode. "Get away from her," he said, his voice low and shaking with barely restrained fury. But Cody didn't back down. Instead, he stepped closer, his grin widening. "Relax, old man. She deserves better than some washed-up mechanic who—" The rest of the sentence was lost as Michael's fist collided with Cody's jaw. The crack of bone against bone silenced the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Cody staggered back, clutching his face, his drink spilling onto the floor. Zelda screamed. "Michael, what the hell is wrong with you?" But Michael couldn't hear her. His vision blurred with red as he stared at Cody, who was now glaring at him with a mix of shock and fury. The crowd began to murmur, their eyes darting between the two men. Michael's heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing the rage boiling inside him. Cody straightened, his smirk gone, replaced with a sneer. "You're pathetic," he spat, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth. "No wonder she's done with you." Michael took a step forward, but two men from the crowd stepped in, holding him back. "That's enough," one of them said firmly, his grip on Michael's arm unyielding. Zelda rushed to Cody's side, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. She didn't look at Michael, not once. The sight of her fussing over Cody, her concern written all over her face, was a dagger to Michael's chest. He felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been punched himself. As the tension in the room settled into an uneasy silence, Michael turned and walked toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of betrayal pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, he heard Zelda's voice, but the words were muffled, distant, meaningless. Out in the cold night air, Michael leaned against his car, his breath visible in the frigid air. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming mix of rage, heartbreak, and humiliation. He had come looking for answers. He found them. And now, nothing would ever be the same. Michael didn't return home that night. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, the frigid air seeping into the car despite the heater's hum. His thoughts churned in endless loops. Zelda's laughter with Cody, her hand on his arm, the cold dismissal in her eyes. By the time he pulled into their driveway, the first light of dawn had begun to break through the sky. The house was eerily quiet when he stepped inside. Zelda was in the kitchen, her back to him as she poured coffee. The smell of fresh brew mingled with the suffocating tension. Michael dropped his keys onto the counter, the clatter breaking the silence. She turned, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "You shouldn't have come to the party." Michael stared at her, incredulous. "That's what you're leading with? Not an apology? Not an explanation?" Zelda sighed, setting down her mug with a deliberate calm that made Michael's blood boil. "You embarrassed me, Michael, in front of my colleagues, in front of Cody." His voice broke as he spoke, each word laced with disbelief. "You're embarrassed? Zelda, you've been lying to me for months, to me, to our daughters. And for what? For him?" Her expression hardened. "This isn't just about Cody," she said coldly, crossing her arms. "This is about us, Michael, about how dead our marriage has been for years." The words hit him like a slap. Michael's breath caught, his hands trembling at his sides. "Dead? That's what you call this? After everything we've built? Our family, our life? That means nothing to you." She shrugged, an infuriatingly casual motion that made Michael feel like the ground beneath him was crumbling. "It's not that simple. Cody makes me feel alive, Michael. Something you haven't done in a long time." "Alive?" His voice rose, sharp and raw. "You think sneaking around behind my back, destroying our family, makes you feel alive?" Zelda's face twisted into a mask of frustration. "You don't get it. You've never understood me." "Yeah." The next blow came later that day, when Michael began sorting through the finances in a desperate attempt to regain some control. Sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open and spreadsheets displayed, he uncovered the full scope of the betrayal. The college fund, the money they'd painstakingly saved for Ellie and Sarah's future. Michael froze, staring at the empty account. His mind refused to process the numbers in front of him. A nauseating dread gripped his chest as he called Zelda into the room. She appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What is it now?" He turned the laptop toward her, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "Where is it, Zelda?" "The college fund. Where is it?" Her gaze flickered to the screen, then back to Michael. She didn't even flinch. "I used it." "You used it?" His voice cracked, his fists pounding the table. "For what? For him? For your dates, your vacations, For us?" She interrupted sharply, her tone clipped. "Cody and I needed it. You wouldn't understand." Michael's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You needed it? Zelda, that money was for our daughters, their education, their future. How could you do this to them?" She shrugged again, her indifference cutting deeper than any insult. "They'll survive. Cody and we need this." The room spun as Michael struggled to breathe, his chest heaving with a mix of fury and despair. "They're your daughters," he said, his voice breaking. "Our daughters. How can you look them in the eye after what you've done?" Zelda's expression wavered for a moment, but then she straightened, her cold mask slipping back into place. "You think you're some perfect father? You've been so wrapped up in your garage and your routines that you didn't even notice I was slipping away." Her words stung, but Michael refused to let them deflect from the truth. "This isn't about me, Zelda. This is about you, about the choices you made, and I'll be damned if I let you take them down with you." Zelda scoffed, grabbing her coat from the back of the chair. "I'm not doing this right now," she said flatly. "Believe what you want, Michael, but I'm not the villain here." As the door slammed behind her, Michael sank into the chair, his head in his hands. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him like a leaden blanket. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had built, was gone. The laughter of his daughters echoed faintly in his memory, a painful reminder of the innocence they no longer had. And in that moment, Michael vowed to fight, not for Zelda, not for their broken marriage, but for Ellie and Sarah, for their future, for everything that still mattered. The house was dark when Michael sat at the dining room table, papers spread out in front of him. Bills, bank statements, and legal notices formed an overwhelming pile, a stark reminder of everything he stood to lose. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house. Zelda had left earlier that day, taking only a suitcase and more of their dwindling savings. His daughters were upstairs, their hushed whispers of worry barely audible, yet piercing. Michael stared at the blank legal form in front of him, his pen hovering over the page. The thought of hiring a lawyer had been his first instinct, but after crunching the numbers, the harsh reality was undeniable. He couldn't afford one. Every dollar had been funneled into Cody and Zelda's lavish escapades. Now there was nothing left but the fragments of what once was. For a moment he considered giving up, just letting it all go. But then he thought of Ellie's laughter, Sarah's determination to get into college, the home they had built together. He saw the fear in their eyes when Zelda had stormed out, the uncertainty about what came next. They deserved better than this chaos. They deserved a father who wouldn't quit. Michael set his jaw and straightened his back, gripping the pen with a newfound resolve. If I couldn't fight for my family, who would? He muttered to himself, the words like steel bracing his resolve. The next morning he began preparing. He pulled every financial statement, every email, every scrap of evidence he could find. Late into the night, he pored over online articles about family law, scribbling notes, and piecing together a strategy. At first, the sheer volume of information felt insurmountable. But the more he learned, the clearer his path became. Michael's mind raced with possibilities. He had enough to prove Zelda's financial deceit, her reckless spending, the empty college fund, the forged documents, and he had his daughters who he knew would stand by him when the time came. The emotional weight was heavy, but with every passing hour his resolve grew stronger. This wasn't just about winning custody or salvaging what was left of his finances. It was about showing his daughters what it meant to stand firm in the face of betrayal, to fight for what mattered. He thought about Sarah, who had once called him her hero, and Ellie, who had always trusted him to make things right. He couldn't let them down. The days blurred together as he worked tirelessly. His garage, once a haven for tinkering on cars, now became his war room. Charts and timelines covered the walls, and his laptop stayed open late into the night. Coffee became his constant companion, fueling his determination when exhaustion threatened to take over. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when he stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was capable of going up against Zelda and her high-powered attorney. But each time fear crept in, he reminded himself of what was at stake. This isn't about me, he told himself repeatedly. This is for Ellie and Sarah, for their future. By the end of the first week, Michael had transformed from a man barely holding it together into a force of will. He wasn't just defending himself, he was preparing to expose the truth. Each new piece of evidence felt like another weapon in his arsenal, another step closer to justice. On the eve of the first court date, he sat down with Ellie and Sarah. Their faces were a mix of worry and hope, their eyes searching his for reassurance. "I need you both to trust me," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Things are going to get tough, but I promise you, I won't stop fighting, not until we're safe, not until this is over." Ellie nodded, her voice small but firm. "We trust you, Dad." In that moment, Michael knew he couldn't fail. The stakes were too high, and the people who mattered most were counting on him. As he climbed into bed that night, for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. The fight ahead would be grueling, but he was ready. For his daughters, for their future. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Michael sat at the plaintiff's table, a stack of meticulously prepared documents in front of him. Zelda sat across the aisle, her expression unreadable, though her eyes flicked nervously toward Cody, who sat a row behind her. The polished presence of her attorney contrasted sharply with Michael, who had chosen to represent himself. Yet, as the judge entered and the bailiff called the court to order, Michael straightened his posture. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to fight. The trial began with opening statements, Zelda's attorney painting her as a woman under immense marital strain who had sought solace in a complicated but honest relationship. Michael clenched his fists under the table, biting back the urge to interrupt. When his turn came, he stood and spoke directly to the judge and jury. "This isn't about Zelda's personal choices," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This is about deceit, betrayal, and the financial ruin she's brought upon our family. It's about my daughters, their future, and their right to a stable home." The first few witnesses called by Zelda's attorney painted her as a devoted mother and a hard-working employee. But when it was Michael's turn to cross-examine Zelda herself, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Michael approached the stand with a calm that belied the storm inside him. Zelda sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a spot just above his head. "You've stated under oath," Michael began, holding up a printed bank statement, "that the college fund was untouched, is that correct?" Zelda hesitated, glancing at her attorney before nodding. "Yes, that's correct." Michael raised an eyebrow, his voice sharpening. "Then can you explain why this account, our daughter's college fund, shows a balance of 0 as of 3 months ago, and why there are multiple transactions labeled as personal withdrawals, all matching the dates of your trips with Cody?" The courtroom was silent except for the soft rustle of papers. Zelda's face flushed, her lips pressing into a thin line. I had to use some of the money," she stammered, "for emergencies." Michael stepped closer, his voice rising just enough to cut through the tension. "Emergencies? Like a spa weekend, a luxury hotel in the city, a $3,000 dinner in Miami?" He flipped through the statement, each accusation landing like a hammer blow. "Is that what you call emergencies, Zelda?" Her attorney objected, but the judge allowed Michael to continue. Michael shifted gears, pulling out another document. "Cody's financial records, obtained through discovery. Let's talk about Cody," he said, his tone dripping with controlled disdain. "Do you know that your so-called partner has a history of targeting women in your exact situation? Lonely, vulnerable, financially stable?" Zelda's eyes darted toward Cody, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Michael held up a highlighted section of Cody's credit history. "This man is tens of thousands of dollars in debt, yet somehow, since he's been with you, he's managed to pay off his car, his credit cards, and even put a down payment on a condo. Care to explain how?" Zelda's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. Next, it was Ellie's turn to take the stand. The young teenager fidgeted nervously, but when Michael smiled at her from his seat, she straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. "Ellie," Michael began gently, "can you tell the court what life has been like at home recently?" Ellie looked down at her hands, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier as she spoke. "It's been hard. Dad's always there for us, but Mom, she's always gone. Work dinners, late nights. Sometimes we don't see her for days." Michael's voice softened. "And how has that made you feel?" Ellie glanced toward Zelda, her eyes filled with tears. "Like we don't matter to her anymore. But Dad, he's the best dad anyone could ask for." "Yeah." Sarah followed, her composure cracking as she recounted her own experiences. "Mom didn't just leave," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She took everything. The money for college, our savings. She stole our future for some stranger." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on everyone in the room. Zelda shifted uncomfortably, but didn't meet Sarah's eyes. The final blow came when Michael called one of Zelda's colleagues to the stand. The woman, impeccably dressed and visibly nervous, avoided Zelda's glare as she adjusted her glasses. "You worked with my wife for how long?" Michael asked. 4 years, the woman replied. "And during that time, did Zelda ever mention her thoughts about our marriage?" The woman hesitated before nodding. She said some things." Michael pressed on. "Can you share those with the court?" The woman swallowed hard before answering. She said her husband was oblivious, that he was a useless grease monkey who wouldn't notice if she drained the accounts and left. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Michael let the words sink in. He turned toward Zelda, whose face had gone pale. For the first time, she looked truly shaken. As the session ended for the day, Michael gathered his papers with quiet determination. The trial wasn't over yet, but he had planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. He had exposed the truth for everyone to see, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the damage Zelda had done to their family, to their daughters, and to herself. The next day in court, the tension was palpable. Michael stood at the plaintiff's table, his eyes sharp and focused, a stark contrast to Zelda, who fidgeted nervously beside her attorney. Cody sat a few rows back, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the trial continued to spiral out of their control. Michael had one more hand to play, and he knew it would be devastating. The courtroom quieted as Michael introduced his next piece of evidence, a set of documents he had fought hard to uncover. He approached the stand, holding them up for the judge to see. "These," Michael began, his voice steady but laced with contempt, "are mortgage documents for our house. They bear my signature, or rather, what appears to be my signature. Your Honor, I didn't sign these." The judge leaned forward, examining the pages as Michael handed them over. Gasps rippled through the room when Michael added, "These documents show that Zelda refinanced our home without my consent. She forged my name." Zelda's attorney jumped to object, but Michael cut him off, pulling out a forensic handwriting analysis report. "This report," he said, holding it up for all to see, "proves that the signature isn't mine. Zelda forged it." The judge's expression hardened as she turned to Zelda. "Mrs. Sanders, do you have a response to this?" Zelda's face flushed crimson, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to." She trailed off, her attorney whispering furiously in her ear. Michael took a step closer to the stand, his voice rising. "So let me get this straight, Zelda. You forged my name, drained our savings, and now you want custody of my daughters? Do you have any idea what you've done to them? To us?" "I didn't mean..." Zelda started, but her voice faltered under the weight of her guilt. Then Michael didn't relent. He turned his attention to Cody, who had been subpoenaed to testify that day. Cody shuffled awkwardly as he was sworn in, avoiding Michael's piercing gaze. Michael wasted no time. "Cody, you've benefited a lot from your relationship with Zelda, haven't you? Paid off debts, upgraded your lifestyle?" Cody glared at Michael but stayed silent. Michael pressed harder. "You manipulated her, didn't you? Encouraged her to steal from her own family to fund your escapades." Cody's lawyer objected, but Michael was ready. "Let me make it easy for you, Cody." He turned to the judge, holding up another piece of evidence. "This is a copy of Cody's bank statements, showing large deposits coinciding with the withdrawals from our accounts. And these are receipts for gifts and luxury items, all paid for with money taken from our daughter's college fund." The judge's stern gaze shifted to Cody, who finally cracked under the pressure. "Fine," Cody spat. "Yeah, I told her we needed the money. She said it was hers to use, so I didn't ask questions." Michael's voice was ice cold. "Didn't ask questions? You didn't care that it came from her children's future?" Cody shifted in his seat, mumbling something inaudible, but Michael wasn't finished. The final blow came when Michael presented the jury with a photograph. It was of Cody, wearing Michael's prized $110,000 watch. The same watch that had gone missing months ago, a family heirloom Michael had planned to pass down to his daughters. "This," Michael said, his voice trembling with anger, "is my watch. Zelda gave it to Cody as a gift, a piece of my family's history, handed over like it meant nothing." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Cody blanched. He tried to speak, but his lawyer silenced him with a sharp glare. Michael turned to Zelda, his voice cutting through the noise. "You didn't just betray me, Zelda. You betrayed our daughters, our family, everything we built together. And for what? For him?" Zelda's shoulders sagged under the weight of her shame, her earlier defiance replaced by a desperate, hollow expression. "Yeah." As the case neared its conclusion, the jury and judge had seen enough. Michael's evidence was damning, his arguments undeniable. Zelda and Cody's lies had unraveled completely, leaving them exposed for who they truly were. In her closing remarks, Zelda's attorney attempted to salvage her case, arguing that she had acted out of emotional distress. But the judge's tone was unyielding as she delivered her ruling. "Mrs. Sanders," the judge said sternly, "your actions were not only reckless but reprehensible. You have demonstrated a complete lack of regard for your children's well-being and financial security. Custody is awarded to Mr. Sanders effective immediately. Additionally, this court will be referring your case to the district attorney's office for potential charges of forgery and fraud." Zelda collapsed into her chair, her face pale as the courtroom erupted into whispers. Outside the courthouse, Michael stood with Ellie and Sarah, the crisp winter air filling his lungs. His daughters clung to his sides, their faces a mixture of relief and gratitude. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Michael nodded, his voice steady. "We're going to be okay, I promise." As they walked toward the car, Michael glanced back at the courthouse steps, where Zelda stood alone, Cody nowhere in sight. She looked small, defeated, and for a brief moment, Michael felt a pang of pity. But it passed quickly. The damage she had done was irreparable, and now, justice had been served. The courtroom was still as the judge began to read her decision. Every word hung in the air like a stone, each syllable a step closer to the end of a long and arduous journey. Michael sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him, Ellie and Sarah leaned forward, their young faces etched with worry and anticipation. "Yes. The evidence presented in this case is both clear and compelling," the judge began, her voice firm but measured. Mrs. Zelda Sanders knowingly forged her husband's signature on financial documents, drained accounts intended for her daughter's education, and used the funds for personal and frivolous expenses. Her actions were not only deceitful but criminal. Zelda's attorney shifted uncomfortably, but Zelda herself remained still, her face pale and expressionless. Cody, seated in the gallery, glanced nervously around, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. The judge turned her gaze toward Michael, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Sanders, your diligence in uncovering the truth and your dedication to your daughters have not gone unnoticed. This court finds the defendant's actions reprehensible. Custody of Ellie and Sarah is awarded to you, effective immediately." A wave of relief crashed over Michael, so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. His daughters reached for him, their arms wrapping around his shoulders as the tension in the room finally broke. He closed his eyes, holding them close, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor," Michael said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For my daughters, this means everything." The judge nodded, her tone resolute. "In addition, Mrs. Sanders and Mr. Cody Lewis will be referred to the district attorney's office for charges of forgery and fraud. Bailiffs, please escort them into." The room erupted in murmurs as two uniformed officers approached Zelda and Cody. Cody protested, his voice rising in panic. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything." Zelda, however, didn't say a word. She stood slowly, her head bowed as the officers cuffed her wrists. For a brief moment, her gaze flickered toward Michael and the girls. It wasn't anger or defiance, it was regret. But it was too little, too late. Michael watched as they were led out of the courtroom, the weight of justice finally settling in. He felt no triumph in their downfall, only a quiet sense of closure. This wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting his family and reclaiming their future. Later that day, Michael and his daughters stood outside the courthouse, the cold air biting at their cheeks. The weight of the past few months seemed to lift with each passing moment. Ellie turned to him, her eyes shining with hope. "Dad, are we really going to be okay now?" she asked softly. Michael knelt to her level, his hands resting on her shoulders. "We are," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's going to take time, but we're going to rebuild. Together." Sarah joined them, her voice trembling. "What about the college fund? Is it gone forever?" Michael smiled gently. "I'm working on that. The court will help recover as much as we can, and I'll make up the rest. You'll still go to college, Sarah. Both of you will have everything you need. I promise." Over the following weeks, life began to stabilize. With full custody secured, Michael focused all his energy on creating a warm and secure environment for his daughters. He transformed their home, removing any lingering reminders of Zelda's betrayal and filling it instead with laughter and love. Michael also worked tirelessly to restore the girls' college fund. He took on extra shifts at the garage, even starting a side business fixing up old cars. Though the days were long and the work demanding, he found joy in knowing that every dollar he earned was for Ellie and Sarah's future. One evening, as the three of them sat around the dinner table, Ellie looked up from her plate, a playful smile on her face. "Dad, you know what's weird?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" We've been eating spaghetti a lot lately. Are you trying to make it your signature dish?" Sarah burst out laughing, and Michael couldn't help but join in. The sound of their shared laughter filled the room, washing away the lingering shadows of the past. Yet, at night, when the house grew quiet, Michael often found himself reflecting on the journey they had been through. The betrayal, the courtroom battles, the heartbreak. It had all tested him in ways he never thought possible. But through it all, he had discovered a strength he didn't know he possessed. He had fought for his daughters, for their future, and for the family they still had. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, Sarah joined him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She leaned against his side, her voice soft. "You know, Dad, I used to think heroes were just in movies, but now I know they're real." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat, placing an arm around her. "I'm no hero, sweetheart. I'm just a dad doing what he has to." She smiled, her eyes shining with admiration. "Well, you're my hero." Yeah. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was theirs to walk together. For the first time in months, Michael felt a sense of peace. Justice had been served, and though the scars of the past would remain, they no longer defined them. Their future was bright, and it was theirs to build. Together. The sun shone brightly as Michael knelt beside the family car, his hands smudged with grease. Ellie stood next to him, her arms crossed in mock defiance. "Do I really have to learn this, Dad?" she asked, her tone half annoyed, half teasing. Michael chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag before gesturing to the tire. "One day, you're going to thank me for this. Trust me, it's a life skill." Ellie rolled her eyes but crouched down beside him, mimicking his movements as he showed her how to use the jack. "Fine, but if I break a nail, you owe me ice cream." Michael grinned. "Deal." The two worked together, Ellie's laughter ringing out as she fumbled with the lug wrench. By the time they finished, her hands were just as dirty as his, but her smile was wide and genuine. Michael couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. These moments, these small victories, were what mattered most now. Inside the house, Sarah was sprawled out on the couch with a stack of college brochures in front of her. Michael joined her, leaning over to glance at the pamphlet she was reading. "Thinking about Stanford again?" he asked, his tone light but encouraging. Sarah nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah, but I don't know, Dad. It feels impossible." Michael put a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "Nothing's impossible, Sarah. You've got the grades, the drive, and the determination. If this is what you want, we'll make it happen." Her eyes filled with tears, and she leaned into him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Michael hugged her tightly, his heart full. He had fought for this, to give his daughters hope and a future they could believe in. Seeing them thrive was worth every sleepless night and every ounce of effort. Later that week, Michael found himself at a local community event, a fundraiser for a neighborhood park. He hadn't planned on attending, but Ellie and Sarah had insisted. As he mingled with the crowd, he found himself drawn into a conversation with a woman named Selma. Selma was warm and approachable, with an easy smile that put him at ease. She worked as a social worker and had been heavily involved in the event's planning. As they talked, Michael realized how much he had missed connecting with someone on a genuine level. "You're really good at this," Michael said, gesturing to the bustling event around them. Selma laughed softly. "Well, it's easier when you care about what you're doing, and it's always nice to meet people who care just as much." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, from small talk about the event to deeper topics about family and resilience. Selma's presence was calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos Michael had been through. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost. Hope. Over the weeks that followed, Selma became a regular presence in Michael's life. She joined the family for dinner occasionally, quickly earning the affection of Ellie and Sarah with her humor and kindness. Michael found himself looking forward to her visits, her laughter filling the house in a way that felt right, like a missing piece falling into place. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Selma turned to Michael, her expression thoughtful. "You've been through so much, but the way you've rebuilt your life, it's inspiring." Michael shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. I didn't do it alone. My girls. They're my reason for everything. Selma placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. And they're lucky to have you. You're a good man, Michael. Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, filling the spaces that had once been empty with something new. He wasn't sure where things would go with Selma, but for the first time, he felt ready to find out. The days turned into weeks, and the house buzzed with life and laughter. Michael's despair had been replaced with a quiet determination, his heart mended by the love of his daughters and the possibility of a brighter future. The cracks that had once threatened to tear them apart had become the foundation of something. As he watched Ellie practice changing attire again, this time with confidence, and Sarah excitedly prepare for her college applications, Michael realized something profound. Life hadn't just returned to normal, it had become better, richer, and more meaningful, and this new beginning was just the start. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the backyard in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the freshly cut grass. Michael leaned back in his weathered deck chair, a cup of coffee cradled in his hands as he watched Ellie and Sarah playing a game of tag. Their laughter rang out, pure and unburdened, filling the air with a joy that had been absent for too long. He smiled to himself, the weight that had once threatened to crush him now a distant memory. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy. There were days when he felt like giving up, when the betrayal and heartache loomed too large to see beyond. Yet, here he was, surrounded by the people who mattered most, his daughters, his family, his reason for everything. As Ellie tripped over her own feet and Sarah fell into a fit of laughter, Michael's mind wandered. Betrayal, he realized, had a way of cutting deep, leaving scars that lingered long after the wounds had healed. But it also revealed truths. It tested the strongest bonds, pushing them to their limits, and, in doing so, showed him what truly mattered. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his thoughts settling. We can't control others, he murmured to himself, but we can choose how we rise. That choice, he understood now, was what defined him. Not the mistakes of others, not the pain inflicted by those he had trusted, but his own resolve to move forward, to rebuild, and to love. That choice had brought him here, to this moment, watching his daughters laugh together, their bond unshaken despite everything. A sudden knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Michael frowned, setting down his cup and heading inside. On the porch lay a plain envelope, his name scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting. He recognized it immediately. Zelda. He stood there for a moment, the envelope heavy in his hand. Curiosity flickered, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger. Resolve. He didn't need to read her words to know what they said. Apologies, excuses, pleas for forgiveness. They couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices she had made. Michael turned, stepping back into the house and heading to the fireplace. Without hesitation, he tossed the letter onto the smoldering embers. The paper curled and blackened, the flames consuming it piece by piece. It wasn't anger that guided his actions, but clarity. Some bridges, he knew, were better left burned. He returned to the deck, the scent of smoke faintly trailing behind him. Ellie and Sarah waved to him, their faces lit with joy, and he raised a hand in return. As he sat back down, a deep sense of peace settled over him. The journey had been hard, the losses heavy, but the gains were immeasurable. In choosing to rise, he had found something stronger, something unbreakable. His family, his future, his life. And for the first time in a long time, Michael was content. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the backyard in a soft golden glow. Michael sat on the porch steps, a quiet smile playing on his lips as he watched Ellie and Sarah laugh together, their voices ringing through the crisp evening air. Ellie playfully tossed a ball to Sarah, who pretended to miss it, the two collapsing into giggles. It was a simple moment, but to Michael it felt like the culmination of everything he'd fought for. His thoughts drifted as he leaned back, hands resting on the steps. The journey hadn't been easy. Betrayal had tested the very core of his family, tearing at the bonds he once thought unbreakable. But it had also revealed something deeper, a resilience he hadn't known they possessed. He'd learned that while he couldn't control the actions of others, he could control how he responded. and in rising from the ashes, he'd rebuilt not just a home, but a future. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Michael stood, brushing off his jeans before opening it. On the porch lay a plain envelope with his name written in Zelda's familiar handwriting. He stared at it for a long moment, the weight of its implications heavy in his hand. Back on the porch steps, he turned it over once, then twice, before sighing deeply. Without opening it, he struck a match and watched as the flames consumed the paper, curling its edges until it was nothing but ash. Some bridges, he thought, were better left burned. As the fire crackled softly in the wind, Michael turned his attention back to the backyard. His daughters waved at him, calling him to join their game. With a smile, he stepped off the porch, the laughter of his family welcoming him into their new chapter. What would you do if your world fell apart? How would you rebuild when everything seemed lost? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of resilience, redemption, and justice. Let's keep the conversation going.